Yokwe. Last year at this same time, my friend Joakim Peter wheeled up here onto this stage to talk with you and express congratulations to you for your hard work and scholarship, and to encourage you to carry on, not get carried away. School is important. All of you know that. Step one is to graduate from high school. And step two is to carry on, either to get a skilled trade or pursue a professional education at a university. Whatever the case, you need to carry on. This year, JoJo and I both intended to participate, to come and visit, not so that JoJo would give a speech necessarily, but so that we could shake your hands and give you copies of JoJo's biography, which we just finished writing, by the way, in December. The plan didn't turn out that way. Many of you know that JoJo died just 3 weeks ago. It was untimely, unexpected, unplanned, and very, very difficult on many, many people, his family, his friends, and others who perhaps didn't know him as a person but knew of him for his work. So I'm speaking to you filled with sadness myself, knowing full well that all JoJo would say is you just got to carry on. You know, the mission is not accomplished. So here I am. I'm wearing the lei that I was given yesterday at the Marshallese Education Day event, and I'm doing so deliberately out of respect and appreciation. So at any rate, my name is Jim Skauge. I'm a retired professor from the University of Hawaii. And I have come to know JoJo very well over the past, perhaps 10 or 12 years. I went out to Chuk, to his campus, some years ago and met him there. He was the director of the Chuk Community College. And then 6 or 8 years ago, he came to the University of Hawaii to pursue his PhD in our special education program, where I was a professor, and he and I had many opportunities to interact and become friends. He graduated with his PhD just last year, and when that was completed, it was a big task. It took 6 years. When he was done with that, we both agreed that we would write his biography. As JoJo would explain to me, many Pacific Islanders don't write their own stories, in part because they don't want to be seen as bragging, thinking that they're better than anybody else. But I think JoJo and I both kind of came to the agreement that if he wasn't going to write his stories, then who would? The way to put it, the question that perhaps says it best is, if not me, then who? If not now, then when? So yeah, I pestered him and I said, listen, you tell me your stories and I'll do my very best to put them into writing, and then we can go through it together and edit it, polish it to your liking. teamwork. So, yeah, here I am. And I was trying to think in just 7 or 8 minutes what I've learned with my relationship with JoJo. And I'll try a few here. The first one I'm going to call adversity. You know, bad things happen to everybody. You know, we say, have a good day, have a great day. What that really is saying is, I hope that today isn't one of those days where a bad thing happens. Bad things they're not bad by definition. You know, when bad things happen, sometimes we grow. We become more sensitive, more caring, more able to move forward. JoJo had some bad things happen in his life. When he was born, he had asthma and suffered from asthma throughout his childhood. I did too, by the way. I'm older than JoJo, but I had it too. And in both of our days, there weren't any medications. There were no sprays that you could take so that you could breathe. So if you were a little kid who couldn't breathe, you know, woke up in the night wheezing and couldn't run very well without losing breath, it was tough. Well, JoJo grew up on an atoll called Etal in the Mortlock Islands in Chuuk, and track and field was very important to the island. Running, that's what kids did. They played volleyball, and they did track and field. Well, JoJo couldn't run. If he did, he would become breathless, and he was also kind of clumsy, so he'd fall down. And he told me laughingly one time that the school was having a track meet, and they asked all the parents to bring fish or food for the festivity. And his grandfather, who was a great fisherman, his grandfather said, I'm not bringing food to this track and field event. I'm not going to sit there and watch my son lose and then have to feed the people my fish. So that was just the way it worked. But instead of being defeated by asthma, JoJo reached the conclusion that if he couldn't run, then he'd better be good in school. You know, he got to be good at something. So he was determined he'd get the best grades. And he had an uncle who was his teacher, by the way, so there was no hiding. Anytime he messed up, his uncle would report him to his mother. Every year, there was a ceremony where the kids' grades were announced to everybody on the island. There were only 200 or 300 people on the island. So it'd be this party, and the teachers, the principal would read the grades, and they'd honor the top students. And JoJo usually got the best, most points. But one year, a girl won. And his mother said to him, you know, are you going to let a girl win? And he said, I'd better work harder. Now, I know many of you now are girls who are perhaps watching this and going on to university. I would say, quite honestly, the girls have won, but that's not necessary to say. JoJo's grandfather, JoJo was raised by his grandparents, by the way. His parents lived just down the road, so it's not like he was very far away from his parents, but his grandparents opted to raise him. And when JoJo was in the 5th grade, his grandfather, who was a village chief and admired by everyone, a great fisherman also, his grandfather went blind. Now, not just so that he, lost vision, he actually went blind. And perhaps some of you have been with blind people and you know what a disability that is. Well, what this meant was that JoJo became his grandfather's caretaker. And he would run home from school every day to be with his grandfather. He took his grandfather fishing, and they farmed taro together and so forth. And I asked Jojo one day if he ever resented having to do this. You know, other kids don't have to take care of a blind person. He does. And I wondered how he felt about that as a boy. And his answer to me was that he never thought about it like that. He never did. He never thought of his grandfather as being disabled. It was just his grandfather. And he said, furthermore, all of us kids on the island had chores to do. We were all busy. There was lots to do to survive. So don't think that I was any different. Jojo's island, Etal, was hit by a terrible typhoon in 1972, I believe it was. He was born in 1964, so that would put him at about age 8. Well, this typhoon hit, and it was so devastating that it destroyed everything on the island. It destroyed everything. Every house, every tree, every garden, all gone. Leveled it. If a tree was left standing, it had no branches and no leaves. So we're talking breadfruit trees, banana trees. The taro fields were all flooded with salt water. And do you know that for over a month, no ships came to the island to bring help? The people had to make do on their own knowledge and ability. And they did. They built shelters, they made fire, they fished, they canoe paddled to other islands to get coconuts, and they came together as one and survived. No one from his island left. They all stayed to recover that island. And no one was killed. During the 2 or 3 days of the actual hurricane event, Jojo took his grandfather's hand and led him through floodwaters to safety. And his grandfather often said in years later that Joakim had saved his life. Can you imagine being a boy saving your grandfather's life? When Jojo was in 9th grade, the summer after his 9th grade, he was going to Xavier High School in Chuuk on the island of Bueno. And he was playing on a stream with a friend, and the stream flowed over a rock face in a waterfall. And Jojo slipped and fell and broke his neck. He broke his neck way high up. So high up, in fact, that he not only couldn't walk, but he never was able to really use his arms or hands again either. It was a terrible, terrible event. And in his story, by the way, he tells the story of that day. Well, if bad things happened to all of us, I think we'd all agree things couldn't get much worse than that. Jojo was flown to Hawaii, where he spent 1 year in hospitals trying to get better. 1 year. Now, this is a boy just out of 9th grade, just like you kids. He leaves his country. He leaves his family because no one came with him. He doesn't really speak English all that well. And he's suddenly, should we say, dumped into an American hospital, unable to move. Bad things happen. So he and I talked a lot about that. And, you know, a person could go any direction when something like that happens. You could just get depressed. You could commit suicide. You could become addicted to drugs. You could, you know, cry yourself to sleep every night. What JoJo took away from this year in Hawaii was that the world was full of good people. It was full of good people. You know, doctors and nurses and social workers and volunteers from the university. And he started to get, my God, you know, nobody knows me. I'm from far away, and yet they're giving me all this love. If I'm going to be loved like this, I need to love back. You know, you learn to give as you've been given. So a bad thing happened, but the lesson taken was, you know, a wonderful lesson of dedicating one's life to service. So I've got a quick little story that I think is funny. It's in his book. But when JoJo was a boy back on Etal, before this accident, he and his friends were playing out in the yard one evening, and they used to catch dragonflies. You know what a dragonfly is? They can be they can be pretty long, and they fly like helicopters. Well, the kids would catch dragonflies, and the way they did that was they'd take a strand of hair, usually a girl's hair that was quite long, and they'd tie a pebble onto the end of the string, so they'd have the hair with a pebble on it so that they could twirl it and throw it up. And for some reason, the dragonflies would go after it. They'd see the hair in the sky and dive into it, and sometimes they'd get tangled up. And when that happened, then the dragonfly would crash, and the boys would catch it. Well, they started taking a piece of paper and putting a little hole in the paper, and then they'd insert the dragonfly into the hole in the paper so that the dragonfly's wings were and the head were on one side and the body out of the back, so that it looked like the dragonfly had a cape, like little, what would we say, like a little superhero. Dragonfly. Well, one day one of his friends said, you know what, let's light the paper and make it a flaming dragonfly. Well, JoJo told me he kind of knew at the time it was a bad idea, but it was just so exciting. So they lit the paper on fire. Now, they didn't have matches or lighters in those days, so they had to go get a fire from a cooking fire, get some leaf on fire, and then bring it over and then light the paper with the dragonfly stuck in it. And then they tossed it up into the air, and the dragonfly started to fly. The paper is burning, and the dragonfly is flying around the yard. And the boys are screaming, this is so awesome. I mean, it is dragonfly. Well, what do you think happened? The dragonfly flew out of the yard into the neighbor's yard, and it landed on the roof of one of the cooking houses. Well, the roofs on his island were made of thatch. Thatch burns. Before they knew it, the roof was on fire, and JoJo and his friends raced into the neighbor's yard and beat on the door and shouted, you've got to get out, you've got to get out, your cooking house is on fire. Well, half the island arrived. People threw water with buckets on the cooking house, and they were able to save the structure of the house, but the roof was gone. It's a bad thing. Well, JoJo said, my grandfather was willing to pay to have the roof fixed. I mean, it was his grandson that did it. Then JoJo said, but my father said no. JoJo's going to learn how to thatch a roof. And JoJo said that was when he and his friends learned how to thatch and thatch the roof. Thought that was a good story of a wise man. Just got a couple more things to say. Let's see here. Maybe I'll say something about helping and being helped. A lot of us don't like to be helped. We kind of grow up and we want to be independent. We don't want to show weakness. Or maybe we're just too shy to ask for help, so we, put up with whatever. When you're somebody like JoJo and you're disabled and you can't really use your hands, and you can't really stand up, and you can't really walk, then of course there's lots of things that you need help with. And if you're going to survive in this world, you better learn how to ask for it. Like he and I spent a lot of time at Zippy's, the Zippy's on Vineyard there. And, we'd order food. Well, JoJo could scoop the food to his mouth, so JoJo could eat if the food was cut up. But, most of us don't think to say, oh, let me cut up your food. That's something we might do for a child, but we don't usually think about doing that for an adult. By the way, there was a Chinese waitress, an immigrant girl from China, working at the Vineyard Zippy's. And she would bring JoJo's food to him, and she'd have already cut it up because she knew. She didn't even ask. She just did it. JoJo tipped her 20% too, boy. When we'd leave that place, he wanted that young woman to know that he appreciated the kindness and the help. Another word that, if you haven't heard it, you will. It's called perseverance. Perseverance means, sticking to something. JoJo finished high school, which was quite a feat. If you read the book, you'll see it was quite an accomplishment just to get through high school, because after his accident, he still had to go back. He had missed a year, and he had to do his sophomore, junior, and senior years, largely with the help of his friends, by the way. Then he went to the University of Guam and got his bachelor's degree. Then he went to the University of Hawaii and got not one, but 2 master's degrees in Pacific Island history and studies. Then he went off in the world and worked for however many years in Chuk as a teacher and educator. And then he came back and got his PhD, which took 6 more years. So if you really add up the math, JoJo was in college for more than 12 years. Now you think about that. When you graduate from high school and you think, man, this has been a long haul. Grade 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12. I'll never live through that again. You might. Another thing, this is winding down now, but I want to give you another word, a key word. It's called purpose. We don't just go to college to make money, okay? We do go to college so that we can make a living. That's all true. But that's not the only reason, and it's not the foremost reason. JoJo, for example, was never rich. He had all this education. You'd think it would just mean he'd have earned millions. Education is also to discover purpose. You go to school in order to better the world, to help your family and your community. And at some point, you start to realize that your community is your family. So you go to school in order to become a nurse or a doctor because people are dying. You know I'm right on that. You go to school to become a teacher because you know that the future depends upon children. You become a scientist because you're concerned about global warming and the environment and the health of our oceans and the realization that our islands are disappearing. You become a writer because you want to write important things, stories and news events that can keep us informed. You study argument so you can become a lawyer and fight for justice. Do you understand? You go to college not just to earn a living. It's how you earn a living. For what purpose do you earn a living? Last thing maybe Jojo would certainly say is to read his book. It's a good story, and Jojo discovered that, I think, in the process of working on it. He expressed to me several times that he hadn't really understood himself that he'd had such a great childhood until we wrote this book, because he really got a chance to think about it. In particular, to think about the people in his life who steered him in the right course, who loved him, who made him thatch that darn roof. Jojo wanted to go fishing at least one more time. He loved to fish. He had learned that from his grandfather. He didn't get to go, at least not in this life. My own suspicion is that Joakim Peter is up there, wherever there is. He's up there, and he's fishing with friends and with family. I don't think Jojo was prepared to leave this world. He had unfinished business. He had things he really expected to do and wanted to do. When he went back to Etal in high school, he finally, after 4 years of absence, he went back to Etal and spent a summer. And while he was there, his father really begged him to stay home. Don't go back to school, his father said. Why go back to school? Stay here with us. We'll take care of you. Here he was, this little guy in a wheelchair, pretty well broken physically. And his father, whom he loves, is pleading with him to stay home and not go back to school. And Jojo turned to his dad and he said, "Who do you think is going to die first?" And his father said, "You are, of course." And Jojo said, "I think I better get on the boat. I need to go back to school." There was a man that Jojo admired who had had a spinal cord injury a lot like his. The man's name was Halona Varden. And Halona went to University of Hawaii, by the way. And Halona had had an accident on a bicycle and had broken his neck. He was a little bit older than Jojo. And Jojo asked Halona if it was worth going to school. And Halona said, "Well, think of it this way. What are you going to have if you don't?" All right. So now that was called a eulogy, right? I'm trying to honor someone who has passed away and has influenced and made a mark on me and on many thousands of others. In respect to him, we ask that you read his book. I don't know how many books you've read. Some of you may have never really sat down and read a book before. I don't know. This has no pictures. It's all words. The stories, many of them were written with you in mind, young people in mind. But we would ask that you read it. And in so doing, appreciate that your parents came from a beautiful world back home. You talk to your parents and your grandparents about their lives. And then you grow in your pride of your place, your homeland. And then realize that in the United States we have a chance to collaborate together as one and appreciate one another's diversity. Okay. I'll end this by saying Comol Dada. Comol Dada.